I'm David Olusoga.
I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And welcome to Journey Through Time. And last time, Sarah, we left Billy the Kid, the great legend of the Wild West, the teenage outlaw. He had just been indicted for the murder of Sheriff Brady, gunned down in broad daylight in the so-called Lincoln County War. We are in New Mexico territory, the heart of the Old West or the Wild West. It is 1878, and Billy the Kid, still a teenager, is fleeing across the desert.
That's exactly right, David. And he starts spending more time in a place called Fort Sumner, far away from where the murder was committed, about 150 miles away. It's a former U.S. Army post, as the name suggests, and it's been turned into a small Hispano settlement. And Billy the Kid has friends there, and he starts to spend more time there. And at some point in that year, in 1878, he meets a man named Pat Garrett. And Pat Garrett is going to become part of the legend of Billy the Kid.
And their names are forever to be linked together, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid.
They're going to be forever linked together thanks to the efforts of Pat Garrett, but we'll get to that later in the story. So Pat Garrett, he's a kind of memorable figure. He was strikingly tall for the time. He was 6'5", which is tall today. And in the 1870s was, that made him a
huge,
giant.
Yeah. I think Lincoln's 6'6".
Yeah.
I mean,
and his height is always commented on. He's gangly, again, like Lincoln. He's got a very typical 19th century handlebar mustache. And he is a former buffalo hunter. So not the kind of profession that's likely to put him on the good side of many listeners today. He was said to have slaughtered up to 200 buffalo a day, which of course was something that he would have taken pride in. As I say, we are less impressed by the wholesale slaughter of innocent animals, I hope. Anyway, I am. But by this point, because the thing about slaughtering buffalo is you put yourself out of work. Once you slaughter enough of them, there's none left. And so he's now drifting, looking for work, and he ends up in Fort Sumner, where, as I've said, Billy the Kid is also kind of hanging out.
So both Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett are in Fort Sumner, not a very big place, in 1878. Do we know if they met each other at this point?
Well, it's a very small place. So they certainly knew each other and encountered each other. The legend and a lot of the Hollywood versions of Billy the Kid have them being very close friends because it heightens the drama of what's going to come if there's a sense of this deep, close friendship and then they have to, decide which side they're on and stuff. But actually, none of the histories that I've read have shown any documentary evidence for that being the case. Part of the legend is that they palled around town and they hung out in the saloons together. And that because Garrett was so tall that they were nicknamed the long and short of it, which is a nice little joke, but does not seem to be true. It just seems more likely that they were just in the same small town at the same time. So they would have known each other, but that's not a very dramatic story. Legends like things to be considerably more dramatic than that. But as we've already alluded to, Garrett is going to become very important in the story of Billy the Kid. He is going to actually be his hunter.
And we're still in the summer of 1878. Billy the Kid is still on the run after the murder of Sheriff Brady. And the war in which that murder took place, the Lincoln County War in that part of New Mexico, that is by no means over.
It is still very much carrying on. And in fact, at this point in the summer of 1878 is when it's going to reach its climax. And it's in the streets of Lincoln. We were talking last time about how it was a range war. So they're kind of skirmishes breaking out in different parts across the area. But at this point, it comes back to Lincoln.
This is Lincoln Town, the big city in Lincoln County in New Mexico.
Let's not call it a big city, David.
Sorry, I estimated the biggest town.
Yeah, it's a very small town, but it's the biggest thing going. So yes, the county seat. And there's a showdown. Both sides kind of gather their forces. Now, McSween has kept going after Tunstall's death, and he's got a gang now that way outnumbers the houses. Remember, the Murphy Dolan faction is known as the House. McSween has about 60 gunmen. So it's a big gang, has descended on Lincoln, and that very much includes Billy the Kid, and they are gathering for a showdown. And it looks as if McSween is set to win just by sheer force of numbers.
So I'm guessing that Billy's presumed that the heat's dropped a bit, and he can go back to Lincoln Town, even though he's indicted for murder there, because that is where the next stage in this conflict is going to take place. That's where the Lincoln County War is going to reach its apex.
Well, it's one of the things that is kind of striking about this story is that, for somebody who's indicted for murder, Billy the Kid is wandering around in the open a lot of the time in the story. But again, it's part of how authority was so diffuse in the West, and the sense that actually these people battling it out, and there are a lot of people just watching to see what happens. There isn't a police force that can go ride in and capture Billy the Kid. So yeah, he's got a lot more freedom of movement than we might expect from somebody who's been indicted for murder. And so he is coming back to join his crew because they are gathering for this big showdown. And then what happens is there's a disruption. We were talking about the black cavalrymen who are stationed in the area at the same time, the famous Buffalo Soldiers. And one of them is just sent into town at the same time that all of this tension is rising. He's sent into town with a message. It's just a mundane, he's riding in. But because they're gathering for this fight, there are these 4 armed men on the outskirts of town, and they challenge the black cavalrymen, demanding to know his business. And so again, tensions are really, really high, and they let him pass. But as he rides through town, shots start to ring out from where McSween's men are gathered from his stronghold. Now, luckily, the innocent black cavalryman escapes unharmed, and he gets back to his outpost. But what it means is that there's an order for the Buffalo Soldiers, the troop, to be sent into Lincoln the next day. So because of this little skirmish, a unit of 35 soldiers is sent into Lincoln, stationed in the center of town with couple of very big guns, a howitzer and a Gatling gun. So they are there kind of announcing that they are prepared to intervene.
So the federal forces have now arrived in Lincoln Town. This war between McSween's men and the House, Murphy and Dolan, the corrupt rulers of Lincoln Town. I mean, it should be game off, really. The army's in town.
Yeah, you would think so. And what's so interesting about the story is it sets up so many expectations that just don't come to pass, that history just doesn't, it's not what happened. So exactly, you would think, well, the federal authorities have arrived, conflict over, but that is not actually what happens. One of the many surprising things that happens is that McSween's men, these 60 tough hombres, these gunmen who are there to battle it out, they panic at the sight of the soldiers and they just flee. They scatter. So about 2/3 of that gang is gone. And McSween suddenly is looking at a much smaller force, and his remaining supporters, so, about 20 men he's got left, including the kid who has not fled. One of the things that was always said about Billy the Kid was how courageous he was under fire. And they hole up in McSween's house on the edge of Lincoln. And the Murphy Dolan men lay siege, and the standoff lasts for 5 days.
This is a siege in an American town with the American army there in town, unable to stop it or unwilling to stop it.
I think it's the latter, unwilling to stop it. The question instantly arises, doesn't it, is how can there be a 5-day siege when there's literally the soldiers are parked in town? But they don't intervene, and they don't intervene because their commanding officer claimed that they shouldn't get involved in a conflict between civilians. Now, you and I might think that's exactly why they were there. But according to their commanding officer, they have to maintain neutrality. However, we said last time that Murphy and Dolan are ex-cavalry.
Both veterans of the American Civil War.
They're veterans, and they're cavalry veterans. So they're very well connected at the local outpost with the cavalry. So when the commanding officer claims neutrality, it's neutrality on one side.
He's favoring the Dolan-Murphy faction, partly because they're all former comrades, former veterans of the Civil War, but partly because they're the people in power.
Yeah. And so it's non-intervention because it looks as if the Murphy-Dolan faction is now set to win this battle, and that's what they want to have happen. So there's this 5-day standoff where the federal troops do nothing, and on the 5th day, McSween's house with these men holed up inside it is set on fire. There are actually very good accounts from some of the survivors of what happened inside that house. We've got a pretty good idea of what was going on. And it was Billy the Kid We were talking last time about his talent for escape, and it's Billy the Kid who figures out how they should escape, how they're going to do it, what they should do, and kind of leads some of the men out of the house. So they wait for dusk to fall so they can't be seen. They go out a back door, and basically they stealthily make their way out of the house because they're literally being burned out. So under cover of the smoke at dusk, they start to make their way out. But only a few of them get out before the house, forces see them, and then they start to open fire. And so in that, Billy the Kid is basically once again escaping under a kind of hail of bullets. And in that hail of bullets, McSween is gunned down.
So that means that both John Tunstall and McSween, the leaders who have been taking on the Dolan Murphy faction, are now both dead. So is the Lincoln County War over?
Pretty much. So the feud certainly collapses, right? Not just because McSween and Tunstall are both dead, but also because we mentioned last time that one of the things that McSween knew about the house was that it was actually financially shaky under all this corruption. And in the middle of all of this, the house has actually gone bankrupt. So they've effectively won, but commercially they've collapsed. However, the key thing to remember is what you just said, David, is that they still have a lot of political influence, and there are other people who are in power who are on their side. So even if they're not commercially viable, that doesn't matter. Still, the people who run things are their allies. And that's how this continues to play out. So the feud basically collapses. Billy the Kid has another miraculous escape. He gets away. He's still riding with the regulators. They're still trying to actually get the guys who have killed Tunstall. That's still what they're attempting to do. They're still riding for vengeance. And what happens is that they're in the vicinity when another crime is committed a few weeks later. One of the men who works at the Mescalero Apache agency is murdered. And because Billy the Kid and the regulators are in the area when it happens, they're blamed. Now, they may have done it. It's not clear. But as far as the story's concerned, it doesn't matter because the damage is done at that point, basically. Billy the Kid's reputation, which is already, building, is sealed. He is now wanted for multiple killings, and they are now starting to call him the most dangerous man in the territory. Now, this is pretty rich because a lot of these guys are killing multiple people a lot of the time. And Billy is starting to get singled out. And again, we were saying that we don't want in any way to, sound as if we're trying to recuperate Billy the Kid. But just to put him in context, he's not necessarily worse than the other guys that he's riding with. But gradually what happens is the forces of power in the area decide that Billy the Kid is the one that they're going after.
And the newspapers are attracted to this idea of this teenage killer, this charming, affable, friendly, courteous gunslinger. So in some ways, he's becoming a victim of his own celebrity. And the newspapers play quite a role in the building of this legend. And the legend is part of what brings about Billy the Kid's downfall.
Yeah. The press starts to get wind of this fairly early on. And, he's got this nickname and it's all kind of catchy.
And it's a good story. You would just have to say it's a good story. It is a child killer who's friendly and affable and polite and has, glint in his eye and bright blue eyes. And the press is always on the lookout for, a character. And as you said, the fact that there is a nickname, I mean, the reason why that nickname becomes so well known is because the press latch onto it.
Yeah. And the whole thing is catchy, right? And so there's a reason why this legend gets built on it, because there are lots of appealing elements in the story. It's kind of ready-made for legend, and they see that and they run with it. So Billy the Kid has escaped again. He's escaped McSween's burning house, almost literally under a hail of bullets. He rides out of Lincoln and he disappears back into the desert.
Now, I'm losing count at this point. Is this escape number 3 or 4? I can't remember.
I've lost count too. It's something like that. And possibly there are others that the story doesn't take into account exactly. But he's good at it. And what I can tell you is that it's not the last, of his escapes. So what we actually know now is that in fact, he rode back to Fort Sumner, So that's very much becoming his kind of safe haven, his refuge. He's got friends there, possibly a girlfriend. The legend likes to say he has one. That's very much, as we said, a Hispano community. And that's where he's hanging out. He now speaks fluent Spanish. He goes to local dances. So again, not necessarily hiding out the way you might expect. He's just gone somewhere kind of far away and he seems to be having an okay time. And he's now also riding with his own small gang. And the locals, I love this detail, the locals call them Los Billitos.
What does that mean?
Well, it means the little Billy, but it means like Billy the Kid. So Billito would be like little Billy, Billy the Kid, little Billy.
Right.
But so they make it plural. And so it's all the little Billies. So
right.
It's Los Billitos, the little Billies.
The Lincoln County War is over. People are counting the costs and counting the damage. There's a lot of legal interest in what's happened. So the war is over, but he has a price on his head.
And it's a big price. And as we've said, the political allies of his enemies are still in charge. So they are still hunting for him. And into this situation rides a new character in our story, a new territorial governor, a man named Lew Wallace, who is a former Union general. And he's sent to New Mexico because, as you said, the word of all this violence is spreading and the federal government has finally taken notice and they send out a new governor and say, you need to do something about this. This is getting a little bit out of hand.
So another veteran of the American Civil War, another man who's seen a lot of violence, who's been sent out to reimpose the rule of law on New Mexico.
And, given the story that we've been telling, David, that's not completely unfair, is it? I mean, could use a little bit of law and order.
Yeah.
We could pause and think about all the civilians who are, we've been talking about how Billy the Kid has his appealing aspects, but, if you're just an ordinary person trying to live your life, you would really like all of this to stop. Thank you very much. Shootouts in the street, are happening. And, you do need to have, some stability reimposed. So Lew Wallace is sent out to achieve that. And he offers amnesty because, of course, you've got in this kind of open conflict, you've got men on both sides who have been, as we've been saying, people committing crimes on both sides. So he offers almost a blanket amnesty and says, if you're willing to testify, you can come in. I won't prosecute you. But he doesn't offer amnesty to everyone. And Billy the Kid is not on the list. Because politically, Billy the Kid's already becoming a big enough name that politically he can't afford to say that he's going to give amnesty to Billy the Kid.
Yeah, this is a general who's been sent into this territory of New Mexico in order to reimpose order. The most famous outlaw in this story is not somebody who politically he can offer amnesty to. Yeah.
But Billy, we said earlier that he was smart. He can see what's in it for him. So in early March 1879, Billy the Kid sends word to Lew Wallace saying that he's open to a deal. There's another murder case because, as we've said, there's a lot of violence happening, lots of killings going on. And he agrees to testify in that murder case if Wallace will give him a pardon. And Wallace agrees. So in late March, Billy actually submits to a fake arrest so that he can testify without looking like he's cooperating with the authorities. They literally arrest him and put him in jail, but he's agreed to fake surrender. This is another instance of what we were talking about where the law doesn't seem that bothered about Billy the Kid wandering around because he's actually kind of wandering around town while he's in jail because it's not really an arrest. By this point, Billy the Kid is popular enough locally that Wallace reported at the time that one night at the prison, he heard singing and he stepped outside to investigate what the singing was. And it was locals literally serenading Billy the Kid at his prison cell window, which is like so straight out of Hollywood, but it literally happened. They all get together with their guitars and they're singing Billy the Kid songs to lighten his prison sentence. I absolutely love that.
And he's in prison to testify. I mean, there's been a lot of killing. He does testify and he does implicate other men who've been involved in the Lincoln County War in crimes on the condition that he will get an amnesty, that he will be pardoned.
Yeah. And then Lew Wallace, the new governor, reneges on the deal. So Billy testifies, he does his part, and they don't pardon him. Lew Wallace just goes back to Santa Fe, doesn't sign the pardon. It turns out that Lew Wallace was actually busy. He had something else on his mind, which is that he was writing a novel. There's a lot of comedy in the story, and this is one of the funniest parts to me. He's writing a novel, which is called Ben-Hur. It came out in 1880, so it comes out as all of this is basically happening.
And this is the Ben-Hur.
This is the Ben-Hur, one of the biggest American bestsellers of all time. Later adapted into multiple films. There's a 1950s blockbuster, which is probably the one you're thinking of, David, starring Charlton Heston. It's swords and chariots. It's like The Gladiator, but it's about Jesus. I love this. The governor who failed to pardon Billy the Kid didn't pardon Billy the Kid because he was too busy writing a mega hit about Jesus. It's the most American thing ever. So there's Billy languishing in jail because Lew Wallace is pissed off to write a best-selling novel. And gradually it dawns on Billy the Kid, who's, as we've said, is not stupid, that they're not going to live up to their side of the bargain. They're not lifting the indictment. He's not going to get amnesty for Brady's murder. And so in early 1879, what does he do? He gets on his horse and just rides out of town.
So he leaves town and he goes back to be with his friends.
Yeah, he goes back to the Hispano friends in the Fort Sumner area, and he's there through the rest of 1880 into 1881. He goes back to what he knows. So he's cattle rustling, but he's not engaged in, again, we need to not think about Billy the Kid as some kind of like psychopathic, permanent, cold-blooded killer. He is killing when he gets caught up in violence, but he doesn't seem to be looking for violence. He's engaged in criminal activity like cattle rustling, but, that's kind of what they were doing at the time. And he is very much, as we've said, becoming embedded in the Hispano community in this area where they really treat him as a close friend, really almost a family member. It's that community, the Hispano community, who start to turn him into a folk hero. Because for them, he represents a kind of rough justice because he's opposed to the same corrupt systems that they're opposed to.
Yeah, so their enemy is being his enemy. He's been fighting the people who've been taking land from them, who've been marginalizing them. So in a way, you can see why they are drawn to him. But he is still a fugitive. I mean, he stepped away. The Lincoln County War is over. The level of violence has dropped. He's involved in illegal activity, but he's still a fugitive. I mean, there's still an account to settle here.
That's exactly the right phrase. That it's gotten to the point where they're not just going to shrug and look the other way. And what happens is that a new sheriff is elected in the area at the end of 1880, and it is the extremely tall Pat Garrett, who we encountered earlier, who has run on a law and order platform and has said, if elected, that he will bring in Billy the Kid because he is now this notorious outlaw who kind of represents the sense of violence and instability. And if you bring in Billy the Kid, all violence will end in the territory. Obviously ludicrous, but that's kind of the message that gets sent. And Pat Garrett is, a competent hunter, unlike some of the other people who are looking for Billy the Kid at various points in the story. Having been elected, he gets onto Billy the Kid's tracks pretty quickly. As we've been saying, though, Billy the Kid's not hiding, very hard. And he tracks him to a hideout at a place called Stinking Springs, a good Western name for everybody, a nice Wild West name.
So I presume a sulfur spring or something like that.
Yeah, one would imagine. And that is near Las Vegas, New Mexico. And Pat Garrett captures him there. Billy the Kid does not go down in flames of glory. He allows himself to be arrested rather than die. And that is when he is transferred back to Las Vegas, New Mexico in the newspaper account that you read, David, to open us last week. So he's sent back to Santa Fe. There he is tried for Sheriff Brady's murder and he is sentenced to hang. After the trial, they move him back to Lincoln under heavy guard. They're going to execute him in Lincoln where everything took place. And he's shackled hand and foot, locked inside the Lincoln courthouse.
And the shackles are because this is a man, a boy who has escaped multiple times when being in the custody of law enforcement. So they're not taking any chances.
Yeah. I mean, he's 21 at this point, so I guess he's just reached his majority, but he's still known as Billy the Kid. Yeah, they're not taking any chances. They're locking him up and determined that he's going to hang for his crimes. But one day, Sheriff Pat Garrett leaves town on an errand, and he leaves behind two deputies, one of whom, named Bob Olinger, is an old enemy of the Kids. Olinger himself is killer. He has a bad reputation. He's one of these guys who's been temporarily deputized, that we were talking about how law and order shifts back and forth. So he's been temporarily deputized, and there's one other deputy, and Billy the Kid is left with these two deputies. And one day on April 28th, 1881, Olinger goes across the street to a restaurant, going to get some lunch. Billy asks to use the outhouse.
This is in the prison in Lincoln town.
This is in the prison. He's shackled, as we said, hand and foot. The remaining deputy walks him out to the outhouse, and Billy the Kid pulls a gun from somewhere, ambushes the remaining guard, and shoots him dead. He then climbs the stairs, grabs Olinger's shotgun, and he waits. And as Olinger crosses the street back from lunch,
Having heard gunshots,
he makes his way back. Billy the Kid is standing on a balcony on the second floor. You would call the first floor. I'm getting myself all British American confused. He's on an upper floor. He's on a balcony, and he is holding Olinger's shotgun and waits. And as Olinger crosses the street, having heard the shots, Billy calls out and kills Olinger with his own gun. The legend is that the kid shouted, "Keep the change, Bob," as he plugged him full of his own buckshot. That's in a Hollywood movie. It's not clear that that comes from any source. I can't stand it up, which is too bad because I like it. But he may have shouted, "Keep the change, Bob," because Bob wasn't a nice man. Let's bear that in mind. And then, however, Billy is still shackled. He's shackled hand and foot, so he can't go anywhere. So he's got all the guns from the armory. He's standing on this balcony. He's got every weapon in the prison, but because he's shackled hand and foot, he can't escape.
So he seems to have had a gun in his cell. Do we know how he got that?
There are questions about this, as you might expect. Nobody knows for sure how he got a hold of that first gun that enabled the breakout. But there was a story that was actually passed down in Hispano families where they took the credit for helping the kid escape. And what they said was that they sent a local boy with a gun to hide it in the outhouse, and that they smuggled a note to the kid that just had one word written on it, which was privy, which of course was the word for outhouse. And that got Billy the info that he needed. So he waits until Olinger leaves, till Garrett is gone, then asks to use the outhouse, knowing that there's something there waiting for him. He gets there and there's a gun, and then he's able to effect his escape. Don't know if it's true, but it's a great story, and they like to take credit for it. So I think we should share it. It does seem that it was one of the Hispano families who actually helped him. It was certainly his allies who helped him eventually escape, because after he waits for about an hour up on that balcony, shackled with all of these guns, somebody gets him a horse. And somehow, despite his shackles, nobody knows how, he mounts the horse and he rides off in broad daylight.
So he has escaped from a sheriff, Pat Garrett, who has run and got his position by promising law and order. The most infamous outlaw in New Mexico has escaped. It's really embarrassing for Pat Garrett. This is not something that can be forgotten about. I mean, Pat Garrett's going to have to now try to track him down again.
Yeah. And look, it's a sensational story. It's embarrassing for Garrett. It's a great story. And so it also gets a lot of play, as you might expect. It electrifies the press. So, Eastern newspapers are starting to talk about the notorious Billy the Kid. It's yet another escape. He's grabbed everybody's guns. He's ridden off in broad daylight despite being shackled. It's a fantastic story.
And his name's now appearing in newspapers like the New York Times. It's appearing in the foreign press, not just the American press. I mean, this is a story in remote Lincoln County, New Mexico, but this is now becoming kind of global news, not just American news.
I mean, it's a great story, right? So guess where Billy the Kid goes? You would think at this point they would know where to look for him.
Well, the obvious place to go at this point, and the safe place, the sensible thing to do, would be to go south of the border, to go to Mexico, to get away from the reach of American law enforcement. That is really the thing that he should have done. But I guess it's not what he does.
It's not what he does. And it's actually what his friends begged him to do, because, as you say, is the sensible thing. But instead he goes like a homing pigeon. He goes back to Fort Sumner, and he is sheltered there by his friends, hiding in various homes. And therefore the word gets to Pat Garrett pretty quickly that that's where he is, because of course he's well known in the area. He's actually not going to hide successfully there for very long once they really want to find him. And in the middle of the summer, July 14th, 1881, Pat Garrett, having, as you say, been humiliated in the global press for letting Billy the Kid escape on his watch, he gets word that Billy the Kid is hiding in Fort Sumner at a friend's house. And so Pat Garrett makes his way there one evening. Dusk is falling, and a man steps out onto the darkening porch, and he has silhouetted. He's holding a butcher knife in one hand and a pistol in the other. And he asks, "Quién es?" which is Spanish for who's there? Who is it? And not being sure who he's looking at, Pat Garrett opens fire. He fires into the dark without waiting to find out who it is who's standing in front of him. And it is, in fact, Billy the Kid, who falls dead, his last words in Spanish kind of hanging over him.
So that is the end of Billy the Kid, the end of his real life story. But in some ways, it is the beginning of the legend. And that's what we'll talk about when we come back from a break. Welcome back. Sarah, the legend of Billy the Kid, that was emerging in the last few years of his life, but it really is supercharged in the months and years after his death.
That's exactly right. And that is thanks in large part to the work of the man who killed him, Pat Garrett, who moves quickly to take charge of the narrative. He actually leaks stories to the local press, and he commissions a ghost-written biography called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, which was very quickly published, 1882. So the next year, he rushes it out.
It's telling that he feels the need to add the word authentic.
Indeed. Protesting too much. Yeah. Nothing authentic about this story. What he does is ensure that the right person is the hero of this story. And guess who that is, David? It's Pat Garrett. The story casts, Garrett as this reluctant hero. He didn't want to do it. And of course, the kid is a bloodthirsty psychopathic maniac. Instead of how we might see him, which is, a young man without opportunity who reacted violently. He was a violent person, but he was reacting violently to a corrupt system. And Pat Garrett was also a violent man in a corrupt system. But Billy the Kid gets turned into the bad guy, and Pat Garrett makes himself the hero.
I mean, this is what we would call taking control of the narrative. The man who ghostwrites the book is a journalist. Journalists have already been doing very well off the story of Billy the Kid. And I guess it's in reaction to the fact that there is, there's some question about that killing, that shooting into a darkened room, that no questions asked, no attempt at an arrest. And Billy did have people who held him in high regard. So there was a question about whether this was excessive, whether this was moral. And the way to brush that aside is to rush out into print this book that delivers a very one-sided story.
Yeah. So Pat Garrett's engaged in what today we would call reputation management. That's what he's doing. And his version basically, it holds sway for the next century. He had every reason to mythologize the killing, not just to justify his own actions, but also to look like less of a fool after the kid's sensational jailbreak, as we were saying a minute ago as well.
The power of the narrative in the book that Garrett has ghostwritten, I mean, that really does, take control of the story. I mean, Pat Garrett doesn't himself live up to the wholesome image that he presents in that book. So you have this kind of contradiction between the image that he creates in this book and the way he lives his life in the years afterwards.
Yeah. Well, this is really the story of the Lincoln County War, really, as we've been saying, is about people who are, all of whom are really quite unsavory characters who are occasionally burnishing their legends and becoming either the good guy in the story or the bad guy in the story. They're all violent. They're all drifters. They're all, involved in various kinds of criminal activities. And in fact, Pat Garrett, he had a serious drinking problem. He became very violent when he was drunk and also, I think, when he wasn't. And in fact, Pat Garrett had a pretty ignominious end himself. He died at 57 when he was shot in the head while urinating in the street. And his murder was never prosecuted.
I think that does pass as ignominious.
I mean, I can't think of very many more ignominious ends. And but it really puts paid to that self-burnished legend of him as this heroic figure, doesn't it? None of them are heroic figures. But by the time Pat Garrett is murdered, the legend of Billy the Kid has been off and running for a long time. As we've said, the press has been keeping his story alive. Dime novels, these popular fictional accounts, are all over the country, and people are grabbing them and reading them. And he's very much becoming part of this very rapidly mythologized Wild West.
And every journalist who gets into this story, they're grabbing at details, and sometimes they're misinterpreting details. They're trying to burnish and add to this legend.
Absolutely. There are all kinds of details that become central to the legend that have no basis in historical fact. So there was a legend that Billy the Kid was a cold-blooded killer and that he laughed every time he shot someone. And that appears in a lot of the Westerns, but there's no evidence of this. None of his contemporaries ever said that. He wasn't really even the leader of a gang of outlaws, which seems kind of central to the myth of Billy the Kid.
It really does. Yeah. I mean, because the Regulators have three different leaders. Billy is involved almost throughout. He's never the leader of the Regulators. He never really seems like he's seeking to be leader of the Regulators.
No, he's just kind of one of the gang, right? And except maybe with Los Bolitos at the end, but he's not really the leader of a gang of outlaws. There's another legend that he was a left-handed killer, which gives him this kind of cachet. But that's literally just because of a photo that got reversed when it was reproduced. So people are looking at a backwards image. None of this stuff is true. And in fact, far from being that kind of cold-blooded psychopath, a lot of the historians looking at the range of people involved in these conflicts conclude that he was actually one of the more controlled figures. There were people around him who were sadistic, who really were psychopathic, but they don't get picked up by the story. It's Billy the Kid who gets picked up by the story.
I was looking at a list of all the people involved in the Lincoln County War, which is really the central event that leads to the legend. And I mean, it's a really, really bad list of some really, really bad people. And the idea that this one person, this one figure, would stand out as being more terrible or more violent than the others, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The reasons why his legend becomes so powerful is not because he was the worst or the most significant of these figures. It's a combination of, as it often is with legends, of chance and luck and age and youth, the fact that a photograph was taken, the fact that he got a nickname that the newspapers liked. A lot of this is chance.
Yeah. And that he was good at escapes. I mean, some of it is his skills, actually, contributing to the legend.
And in a long list of unappealing people, he is one of the most appealing, you'd have to say. I mean, there were very few other people in that list where there were accounts, people saying he was courteous and polite and he was nice to women.
Had a sense of humor.
We don't get much of that with any of these others.
He had redeeming characteristics, and some of them don't seem to have any at all.
The other thing is timing. The legend is born in the late 1870s, early 80s, the age of the dime novels. But it's also just 20 years, 2 decades before the beginning of moving pictures.
Yeah. This is one of the reasons why the legends of the Wild West gain the traction that they gain, is because that story historically coincides with the emergence of mass media. And so the story kind of catches its mechanism for transmission. And so there's stage melodrama, there's dime novels, there's magazine fiction, there's all of this stuff. And then there's movies. And of course, Billy the Kid is just made for the movies. So he's already being filmed in silent cinema, as you would expect. But what you might not expect is who the first actors to play Billy the Kid were in 2 films, both made in 1911. And he was played both times by girls.
To stress the youthfulness, that he was a boy rather than a man.
I think so. That's certainly how I interpret it. And it restores that sense of his innocence, doesn't it? So it's letting him be this romantic figure. And it kind of suggests that it was all adolescent play rather than, he wasn't so much of an outlaw as just this young person led astray. And that story starts to take hold increasingly. In 1926, there was a hugely popular biography, a best-selling book called The Saga of Billy the Kid. And that really takes that idea that Billy the Kid is an innocent led astray to town. It casts him as this kind of teenage rebel who died young, that he's, reckless and romantic and doomed. And it's, 1926, it really casts him as a kind of hero of the First World War generation, right? This romantic doomed youth.
Yeah. And in the 1920s, America is looking at the period of the frontier of the Old West with a nostalgia. It's now a generation away.
Yeah. And they're looking at it to do some political work for them because it's an era of mass immigration. And white Americans are really embracing stories about the Wild West that center white American history and can justify white American history. And these kinds of stories of the Wild West, so they serve a lot of cultural purposes. They do a lot of work and they become really popular as a result.
So this is why we see the stories of the Hispano community and of the Native American communities who are central to this story in reality. We see them and what happened to them being brushed out of the story.
Yeah, they get whitewashed out of it literally and figuratively. And it becomes a story about white people because that's the story that the kind of dominating Anglo culture wants to hear, and wants to tell itself. And that sense that Billy the Kid's story could be turned into, could do cultural work, that it could serve a purpose for a given era. That's going to shape the way that Billy the Kid's story is told over the rest of the 20th century.
Because like all the best legends, it can be adapted to the circumstances of any period. It can be repeated and remade and reimagined in all sorts of different ways. So there are more films, aren't there, in the 30s and 40s?
Yeah. And each one kind of stands in for its moment. So for the Great Depression, there's one from 1930, which has him as the symbol of the little guy, who's, the victim of crooked capitalists and corrupt law enforcement, very much a kind of Great Depression era take on the forces of capitalism, right? Also might be the take for our moment, possibly, some might think. But when you get to the 40s, suddenly, it's World War II, and suddenly he is a loyal, patriotic American who's fighting for truth, justice in the American way as the Second World War kicks off, right? So he becomes the hero for that moment. And then in the 50s, he becomes a Cold War Billy the Kid, and he's played by Paul Newman in a film called The Left-Handed Gun. We were saying he's not really left-handed, but for Paul Newman, he is. And here suddenly he's a kind of James Dean figure. He's rebel without a cause. He's an anti-hero. And so there's all of this kind of, adolescent inner turmoil. And so you can really track him, Billy the Kid, as this kind of, symbol of each era.
The most famous film is probably this 1970s film, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid.
Yeah, that is Sam Peckinpah's revisionist Western. So this is when in the 70s they start to remake the Western and start to see that it's not always it's actually not the story of, heroic figures, and to start to tell a grittier, more sordid, more realistic version of the Wild West. And this is Sam Peckinpah's film with Chris Christopherson.
It was so gritty that the studio re-edited it because they wanted it to make it more glamorous and more simplistic.
Yeah. And it was a commercial flop in the US. As a result, it's actually been rediscovered. There's a director's cut where people have, rediscovered it as actually a masterpiece of cinema, whatever you may think of it as history. It's really in the shadow of Vietnam. So it's got Chris Christopherson playing Billy the Kid, and it's set to a score by Bob Dylan, who actually has a bit part in the film as well.
As you know, I don't like Westerns, but I do love Bob Dylan. So
this is
Dylan? one of the few I've seen. And it's a very Bob Dylan strange performance. It's very interesting. But the music, obviously the most famous song that Bob Dylan writes for Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid is Knocking on Heaven's Door, one of the kind of great songs of the 70s.
Yeah, and that comes from this. So a lot of American pop culture that people are familiar with, they might not know that it actually has origins in Billy the Kid, and Knocking on Heaven's Door is one of those. For our generation, David, I'm sure you remember as well as I do.
I do remember. I remember going to the cinema to see it, which ages me.
Yeah, exactly. Both of us. I went to the cinema to see it as well. Young Guns in 1988.
The Brat Pack version of Billy the Kid.
It was the Brat Pack version of Billy the Kid. I think Emilio Estevez portraying him must have been the first time that he was portrayed by someone of Spanish descent, actually.
Yeah, which is ironic. Yeah.
Which is ironic and interesting. But it is also the first version that starts to include the Hispano perspective, because they have Lou Diamond Phillips' character playing Chavez y Chavez. Is starting to make its way back into the story. But as you say, it's a brat pack, Billy the Kid. It's the kid as cocky celebrity outlaw, very much in the style of Top Gun. You'll notice the similarity with the name Young Guns, where Top Gun had come out just a couple years earlier, and they're clearly trying to capitalize on that success. And they did. It was a really successful movie.
But with all of these versions that speak to different moments of the 20th century, there's people who just don't get included. I mean, we've talked about the real history here that involves African Americans, Native Americans, Hispano Americans. They sometimes get a look in, but very rarely.
Yeah. So with each version, the story simplifies down to its kind of constituent elements. And then that's part of what makes it so easy to replicate and adapt, is because if you get rid of all that specificity, you can make it a story, for anybody about, anything. There are some historians who say that the kid has been the subject of more narrative versions, whether, film, novels, what have you, than any other single individual, including Napoleon, Lincoln, or Joan of Arc. Now, I don't know how you could count that with such certainty. It's pretty hard to actually, you and I both know this, pretty hard to catalog these things. But he's certainly up there. His story has been told and retold and told again. And so what's left, as we're saying, is a kind of legend that's so stripped down that it can mean anything and nothing. And the politics of the real history fade further and further away.
I think everybody has heard of Billy the Kid. I think some people might have heard of, Jesse James, another famous American outlaw. But I think Billy the Kid is on a different level of name recognition. And yet the actual details that we've been talking about of the actual history, they're kind of overwhelmed by the power of the legend and the kind of allure of this story. And the newspapers of the 1880s could see this was a great story. So it's not surprising that movie makers in the 1980s could see it was a great story.
Yeah. And, the sense of the appeal of the story is also shown by the fact that conspiracy theories flourish around it, because conspiracy theories are when people want to write their own story, right? When they find it satisfying to spin out a different version. It's a kind of version of fan fiction, really. I
just want your opinion on this. I mean, from what we know from the sources we have about his letters, about what other people said about him, his legend was emerging in his final years. Do you think in some ways he ever played up to the legend?
It's a really good question. There's a lot of self-deprecation in his interviews. So he has this kind of wry, understated delivery in them where he says things like, well, and some of them are in the court records as well, where they say, are you known as Billy the Kid? And he's like, well, I'm called the Kid sometimes, but I don't know about this Billy Kid thing. So he's kind of undercutting it and he finds it amusing. I mean, there's a great letter that he wrote to Lew Wallace, the governor, who was too busy writing Ben-Hur to write back to Billy the Kid. He writes this letter to Lew Wallace, saying where the soldiers should go look for the escaped man that he's turning evidence on. And he writes to him and he says, you should take my advice because it's possible that I know more about how men hide from soldiers than you do. Which, is a pretty, kind of bullshit thing to say to the governor that you want to get amnesty from. And he's like, look, dude, I know what's going on here and you don't. And I just think that's really funny, right?
To write that from a prison cell when you're 21 years old. The tragedy I see in his life is that he does what so many young men then and now do, which is he gets swept up in a pattern of violence that doesn't end because you're fighting for the dead. There's always a reason to keep fighting because you're fighting for your friends, your mates who've been killed. That is so often the story of young men trapped in violence. It's a big story in gang violence that it doesn't stop because it's driven by a sense of vengeance. And that's what people mean when they talk about a cycle of violence.
I think that's a really good point. I think the other thing, though, that his story shows that is implicit in the story that we were telling is that he became famous because the powerful people around him were looking for a scapegoat. And he really was a scapegoat. They could have chosen any number of even more unsavory characters than he was to go after.
In some ways, his story shows the danger of being a good story.
Yeah. And having caught the attention of everyone, as we were saying, then they couldn't afford to let him go. And in fact, the Hispano community saw him so clearly as a scapegoat that they had other nicknames for him. They took his name from Billy the Kid to Billy the Goat, because of course there's a pun there from kid to goat, right? So from Billy the Kid to Billy the Goat, otherwise known as Billy the Scapegoat. And what the story is doing there, what it allows the people in charge to do, is to distract attention from all of the other violence and suggest that he's like the one rotten apple and that everything else is fine. And there is no corruption. There is no systemic structural problem. But as we've been saying, this is a world full of corruption and violence. But by fixing on one scapegoat, they can say, Billy the Kid was the bad apple. He's the bad guy. Pat Garrett, no, he's a good guy. And that's the myth's real power, right? Is that it actually condemns the outlaw and then excuses everything else that's happening and says the system's fine it's just that kid, Billy the Kid. He's the one we need to take care of.
It is fascinating and tragic, and you can see why this is a legend that just keeps going. Sarah, that was fantastic. Let's leave it there and see you next week.
Look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks for listening.